I'll put it this way. So we have mental illness, emotion, memory learning, consciousness. Wow. I think I just missed a S. S-C-I-O-U-S. Consciousness. So those are our 4 sort of things that have been volunteered. Any last ones before we... So I'd like you to take a second and think about which ones you would particularly like to cover. There's a decent chance we can cover like 1.5 of these, or sort of, you know, we'll try to do like really thorough discussion of one of these, and then a little bit less so on another one of these. But we'll do some coverage of it. So what I'm going to ask you to do is vote. How should we do this? I think I'd like you to vote for your favorite. I know you might like to, I mean, the other way to do it is people could vote for each one that sounds interesting, but then we might just vote for all of them every time, and then we don't get there. So let's just try, like, which one do you think is your favorite? So I'm going to start at the top. So who would really like to do mental illness? Lots of people. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. All right, I got 15. What about emotion? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's like this localized collection of people that like emotion. I think that's interesting. Memory learning. 2. I really like memory learning. Okay. Consciousness. You said 1, 2, 3. Okay. So we will definitely do a unit on mental illness. Again, that's the one I'm least comfortable with, but that's okay, you know, because you guys have lots of, like, you know, I mean, if you've taken psychology courses or other kinds of courses, you may have a lot to bring to this. I'm going to do my best with it, but I think it could be interesting. And then we'll probably choose one other one to kind of dive into. I am kind of leaning, I just based on numbers, maybe what we'll do is we'll go, so we'll do sort of brain rhythms, patterns, not consciousness, but sleep stuff and general brain state stuff. Then I think we probably will, maybe we'll go to emotion because it comes first, and then we'll probably do light on emotion, but we'll do that, and then we'll do a unit on mental illness. That could be a fun way to finish off the semester. So, all right, thank you. So that'll be our plan. I'm going to write that down before I forget. Okay. Thank you. All right, so, oops, you can't see that. So that's what I just wrote. So plan is, today we are going to continue with chapter 14, finish off talking spinal tracts. We'll do motor cortex, we'll do motor loop, maybe. Wednesday we're going to finish the chapter lecture, and then we will at least start the discussion of the homework. So the homework, I think, is due and should continue to be due on Wednesday. That's right? Is that? Oh. Well, that's fine. You sure? You're sure. Okay. I had it in my head I said Wednesday, but that's fine. That's fine. That works just fine. We probably wouldn't have much time for it anyway. It just means I get to go slower. So Friday, the homework will be due. I guess the issue there is I really want to do a quiz. Well, I mean, we can do both. I just hate to do them both on the same day, but I want to get back into this habit of doing quizzes, and I probably should have had the quiz on Wednesday, but I was thinking that was short notice. So, I don't know, are we okay with quiz on Friday? No? Well, I mean, would you rather Wednesday or Friday? That's kind of the question. All right, let's vote. So, all right, I don't care. I really don't care. So quiz on Wednesday, vote if you want it Wednesday. Somebody said Wednesday. Who wants quiz on Wednesday? You got to fess up. No, we can figure something out for you guys. All right, it's 2 of you. Who wants Friday? Fridays have it. So we will do quiz, but also we're going to do homework on Friday. So I know that's 2 things. I'm sorry. I don't like to do 2 things at the same time, but that will be on Friday. So Wednesday is we'll just be doing chapter 14 lecture, cruising along with that. Then we'll do homework on Friday as well as quiz on Friday. Quiz will be same format as usual for the most part. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Well, let's keep going with what we were doing. So we were talking spinal tracts. So the first thing we did is we talked about the cortical spinal tracts, and mostly we talked about the lateral cortical spinal tract, which was how the lateral cortical spinal tract is like the control of distal muscles. So this is, the thing that you're really doing intentionally. So as you reach down to pick up the bottle off the table, the gripping and the sort of like the descent of the hand, like all that stuff you're really focusing on, that's going on through lateral cortical spinal tract. But we also have these other tracts. So we have the vestibulospinal tracts, which I think is where we ended last time, which is using information from your vestibular system to power motor action. And so the idea is that as I sort of lean forward to grab hold of the bottle, and I'm focusing on what my arm is doing, simultaneous to that, I'm kind of leaning forward, which means my whole body's starting to pivot forward, which means I'm going to start to excite my otolith organs, which will feed into this loop to help reinforce and cause actions to occur, motor actions to occur, to help me maintain balance. So in the case of sort of leaning my head forward, which is caused by the leaning of my body forward, my otolith organs would detect that leaning, which would send input to the lateral vestibular nucleus, which then in turn would send input to the vestibulospinal tracts, which would send signals down to my legs to help me increase the contraction of my legs and deal with the fact that I'm starting to tilt forward and be a little off balance. And a lot of that's happening without sort of really, really obvious conscious control. Like we have voluntary control over our leg muscles if we want to, but a lot of the control that we're doing on sort of a day-to-day basis, as you reach forward, you're not thinking about the fact that you're increasing contraction of your hamstrings, for example, to resist that tendency to fall forward and keep your balance. That's happening through these vestibulospinal tract pathways, at least in part. So the idea is that these tracts are going to send signals that support your core muscles, your abdominal muscles, your thoracic muscles, to help, and also some of your big leg muscles, so that you can perform voluntary actions with your cortical spinal tract without falling over and losing your balance. That's kind of the idea. Turn the lights down a little. Okay, so that's another tract. A little less obvious intentional control of it here. Here's another one. So this is the tectospinal tract. Tecto, like with most of these, you should look at the name and try to figure out where the thing goes. So cortical spinal tract is coming from your cerebral cortex. Vestibulospinal is coming from vestibular nuclei. Tectospinal tract is going to be coming from the tectum. Do you remember what the tectum is? Like, it's a thing, but what does it do? Like, what's there? What structures or what? Colliculi? Yeah, it's in mesencephalon, so it's part of your midbrain. It includes your superior and inferior colliculi. Those are pretty much the main things that are there. So we talked about superior colliculus is about visual reflexes, inferior colliculus is about auditory reflexes. Here, you've got signals originating primarily, in this case, from the superior colliculus of your midbrain. So this is part of the tectum, right? And that's why it's called the tectospinal tract. So we have axons that will, the cell body is up in the superior colliculus, and it's sending signals that cross and go down through the midbrain, down through the medulla, and ultimately send signals down to the spinal cord. And if you remember what the function of the superior colliculus is, I just sort of said it, this is about visual reflexes for the most part. So these are, when we have visual reflexes that need and require skeletal muscle motion, we're not talking about motion of eye muscles, because those are controlled by cranial nerves. So you would never get into the spinal cord. But sometimes you're going to control neck muscles, for example, and maybe even some core muscles to do something like track a moving object across the room. So as a moving object flies across the room, you can use some of these visual reflexes that are powered by your superior colliculus to move not only your eyes, but your neck and even your core, your sort of torso and big leg muscles, to allow you to track that motion as it crosses the room. So you're orienting your head towards important stimuli, and you're helping to reinforce those kinds of reflexes. That's kind of like what it does, really. So it's pretty straightforward, But again, the idea is we're not originating up in the cerebral cortex. We're starting in the tectum, in the superior colliculus, and then sending a signal ultimately down the spinal cord to the appropriate level to power your neck or core muscles to help track objects. Mm-hmm. I mean, it'd be something we have voluntary control over those muscles, but yeah, you can think of this as more involuntary, more reflexive types of actions that we can execute through this pathway. So I like to think of like the really conscious decision, the things we're mostly paying attention to are mostly going to be corticospinal tract driven. But we've got these other ones that kind of do things on the side for us that we're not necessarily thinking about all the time, which is kind of neat. We're not as thoughtful people as we like to think we are. I think that's the idea. Here's another one. So these are the reticulospinal tracts, and I'm calling them tracts here because there's really two. We have a pontine reticulospinal tract, which, not surprisingly, if it's a pontine reticulospinal tract, it's originating in the pons. Anything pontine means coming from the pons. And what this tract does is that it facilitates anti-gravity reflexes in the leg. So by anti-gravity, I mean those reflexes that cause your legs to, usually to contract in order and extend in order to oppose gravity. So as I'm standing here, my legs are engaged. Generally got my knees locked, but they don't have to be. But as I'm shifting around, I'm adding weight onto different parts of my legs. And I've got proprioceptors that are detecting that increased weight. And in response to that, I have reflexes that will help to maintain that extension and even increase the amount of force I'm putting into extension to keep myself from collapsing in the face of gravity. So these are anti-gravity reflexes. They're helping me to stay upright. And that's going to be present within the legs. To some degree, it could also be torso muscles. But again, these are mostly, we usually talk about these sending signals down to the legs. So we're maintaining a standing position, be the way to think about it, with these reflexes. Then we have a competing center. It's called the medullary reticulospinal tract. So instead of coming out of the pons, like this one, the pontine center, the medullary reticulospinal tract comes out of the medulla. It's going to travel then down these reticulospinal tracts and go to some of the similar kinds of muscles, but what it will tend to do is actually inhibit these anti-gravity leg muscle reflexes. So the idea is that using this system, if you want to start to move your legs around, you'll send output down the medullary reticulospinal tract to these leg muscles, which kind of it lets them escape from the reflexive actions and then execute more voluntary actions. So if I want to kick on a walking cycle, for example, or if I want to, crouch down, for example, doing something other than sort of maintaining my standing reflexes, I'll kick on the medullary reticulospinal tract, which kind of shuts down all these reflexes, which then allows my legs to do other things. So you can think of these as kind of competing with each other, right? So the pontine center is wanting you to maintain a vertical standing position, whereas the medullary reticulospinal tract, that information is going to allow you to be liberated from that so you can do other things if you need to or want to. So as we shift around, there are interactions that will occur, and not all these are directly conscious sorts of interactions. Some of these things are kind of operating in the background, but there'll be interactions between your pontine centers and your medullary centers that allow you to shift your balance and initiate or sort of move into intentional movement patterns. Does that make sense? Again, I think it's kind of neat to think about, like there are all these different centers that are operating and aiding us in movement in ways that we're not necessarily always immediately conscious of. We're just sort of, our brain is doing this for us in the background so that we can execute the really specific intentional motions that we're otherwise trying to do. I sometimes wonder if like really, really good athletes that I think I use the term physical geniuses, if they're really good at some of these things, like that might explain some of why they have just outstanding balance and coordination, because they're really good at these kinds of pathways, maybe in addition to the lateral corticospinal tract type pathways. Okay, so the idea at this point then is we've discussed all the ways in which motor output can go from the brain down the spinal cord. Again, I keep coming back to the big one the one I'm most interested in most of the time, and most of us are most interested in most of the time, is that lateral corticospinal tract that carries all the intentional information down. But then we have all those other ones, vestibulospinal tract, the reticulospinal tracts, the tectospinal tract, these different tracts that convey other kinds of motor output from the brain, just not from the cortex, down the spinal cord, and help us to control our body position and make sure that we don't collapse into the ground. So what we want to do now is pan up and go into the brain. And really, we're going to focus primarily on what is going on in the cortex. So what are the brain centers that run that lateral corticospinal pathway that seems to be that really interesting one that allow for intentional types of motions with our skeletal muscles? And there's 3 different areas within the primary motor cortex, and we'll try to hit each in turn more or less. So there's a primary motor cortex, a premotor cortex, and a supplementary motor area, all 3 of which did show up back in chapter 7 in the appendix, but now we're going to really try to spend some time and understand what they do. So here's a picture. So the motor cortex would be your primary skeletal muscle motion control center, I think would be the way I put it. And it consists of area 4, which is this red area. This is the precentral sulcus. So there's this, the precentral gyrus. So the central sulcus is this line running right along here. This area, S1, this was our primary somatosensory cortex, or the postcentral gyrus. Here in the precentral gyrus, we have our primary motor cortex, which is also referred to as area 4, because that's Brodmann's area 4. Sometimes it's also called M1. The 1 refers to it being the primary motor cortex. And that's sort of analogous to this area being called S1, the primary somatosensory cortex. So it's got kind of 3 names, maybe 4 names. Primary motor cortex, precentral sulcus is like strictly the anatomical definition of it, which is the same as area 4. And then this whole area, we also refer to it as M1. So we've got 4 names for it. Isn't that nice? But that's the way they do things in the brain. Why stop at 1 name when you can have 4? In addition to area 4, that primary somatosensory cortex, we have these other processing areas that are a little bit more complicated. We have the premotor area, which is basically from this little dotted line down. And then we have all this area up here, which is called the supplementary motor area. And Brodmann didn't really see a difference histologically, so we call all of that area 6. But it really is broken into those 2 areas. The idea is that if you're doing some kind of voluntary motor action, pretty much by definition, M1 is going to be operating. The primary motor cortex will be stimulated. So there'll be activity in the primary motor cortex anytime you're moving. So you could think of that as like the fundamental motion happening, sending signals to skeletal muscle area. Anytime you send signals to your skeletal muscles, you've got this area excited and sending inputs down axons that are going to ultimately travel down that lateral cortical spinal tract and into your spinal cord. In addition to that, we then have these other areas that are seem to be involved in controlling planned, complicated actions. And for example, rather than just being able to extend or flex your elbow, if you're trying to do some kind of precise action with it, be it reaching down to grab a thing off the table, which requires sort of a really precise series of actions, or if you're playing an instrument or something and maybe you're playing guitar and you require really precise sort of strumming patterns, or you're doing something that involves a different pattern happening on one side versus the other side, so you're trying to like screw 2 pieces of something together. Those levels of actions require input or output coming from not just the primary motor cortex, but also 1 or more of these sort of additional motor areas, the supplementary motor area or the premotor cortex, or premotor area. So we refer to these sometimes as the PMA or the SMA. In some ways, like the way I originally learned this stuff, I think the original thought was that these centers send information to the primary motor cortex, and then the primary motor cortex would send axons down the spinal cord. And that is partly how it happens. However, these areas, the SMA and the PMA, also send axons directly down the spinal cord in the lateral cortical spinal tract. So it's not like these guys are only operating through the primary cortex. They do that. They talk to the primary motor cortex a lot, but they also directly can send output down your spinal cord towards those lower motor neurons that actually power the skeletal muscles. So again, the idea is area 4, this is your sort of fundamental movement area. And it is the case, if you've got damage in this area, you can suffer from paralysis. So it does seem to be necessary for any kind of motor action that occurs that your primary motor cortex is operating. However, you can, in contrast to that, if you have damage in the SMA or the PMA, you can run into conditions like apraxia, which is where you lose ability to perform some complex motor actions, but you do not have paralysis in that tissue. So, if you've learned, I guess an example might be is if you learn to play piano, so you're really good at playing piano, or maybe you're really good at typing, and then you have damage into some of these areas, that could result in loss of the ability to play piano or loss of ability to type, but you'd still be able to move your fingers. So you're not paralyzed, you just lose that motor, that sort of specific motor function. Okay, so these are doing more complicated types of motor actions. Now one thing, I think we'll start with the primary motor cortex. The one thing I do want to point out about the primary motor cortex, which again is running sort of right side by side with that primary somatosensory cortex, is we see the same kind of somatotopy happening in the primary motor cortex as we do in the supplementary motor cortex. No, not supplementary. So this area, M1, primary motor cortex, has somatotopy just like S1 over here does. So if you remember what somatotopy is, it's just this idea that there's something of a map of our body that you can identify in our brain, in that as you move from the dorsal part of your primary motor cortex and then move down laterally, you start to encounter neurons that are powering or sending signals to different skeletal muscle groups. So up here towards the dorsal surface, you have motor neurons that when they get excited, they send signals that cause movements and contractions in your knee or your hip or your torso. And then as you move over a bit more laterally, you start to run into upper motor neurons that send signals down to the hand. And then as you move even further, you start to get into upper motor neurons that send signals down into your face via facial nerve. So this is sort of a different pattern of output. But in either case, you have a similar kind of a mapping. I mean, you can compare this map side by side to the somatosensory map that we saw, the somatotopic map. And you see pretty much the same kind of relationship there, where you kind of have legs, torso, hands, and then face in both cases for sensory input in the postcentral gyrus back in the parietal lobe. And then here in the frontal lobe, you've got all of your motor output to the same areas that are almost sort of like in neighboring spots right alongside, right along that central sulcus. So I have a description. Here's an experiment one could do. You could basically take an electrode and stab it in sort of like right around here and run current into that electrode and look for responses in skeletal muscle movement there, versus if you instead plugged in the electrode more laterally, you could repeat that process and look for differences. What would you expect to happen in those two locations? So if we plugged in sort of dorsally or if we plugged in laterally, what kinds of responses would you expect to see in the person that you're doing this to? If you don't want to do it in a person, you could do it in a mouse. Could be kind of fun. I mean, so dorsally, like what do you think you're going to do if you send electrodes injecting current into the dorsal part of the primary motor cortex up there? What do you think? Yeah, I think you'd expect legs or hips to start moving, right? Because these are some of the really important upper motor neurons that are sending signals down the spinal cord to those alpha motor neurons that cause contractions in our muscles. So you wouldn't expect anything like, if you're just injecting current, you would not probably expect coordinated actions, but you might start seeing their legs start twitching around a little bit. In contrast, if you plugged in laterally, so if you plugged in like right here, I mean, this area is not controlling the legs, it's controlling jaw movements or lip movements. So you might see the animal start to move its jaw or start to move its lips a little bit. Kind of fun. Okay? So that's the primary motor cortex. Again, the idea with the primary motor cortex is anytime you are doing some kind of voluntary action, you are sending signals, you are getting signals originating within this primary motor cortex. So any kind of skeletal muscle movement that we're generating from our cortex is going to involve motion or involve stimulation of your primary motor cortex. But we also have these other motor areas, so we need to try to figure out what those do. So beyond the primary motor cortex, we want to understand what's happening in the premotor area and the supplementary motor area. So here's an experiment that might help us to understand this first one, the premotor area. We'll start with that one. So in this experiment, you have a little monkey, and you have him in a room with this little display thing. And the display has a series of buttons that can light up. And it also has these squares that can light up. These squares are not really buttons, they're just sort of lamps that will light up at different times. And you can decide to stimulate these whenever you wish to. And you basically train the monkey to interact with this box, and in so doing, it can ultimately get a reward. And here's what you train the monkey to do. You train the monkey to push these buttons down here, but you train them such that they will only push the button if first there is the little square lights up, and then afterwards, when the square has already lit up, then the little green light on the button goes on. Okay, and they're not pushing the button until such time that the little green light on the button goes on to get their reward. So if they push the button, for example, when this thing, we call this the instruction stimulus. It's kind of like instructing them of where they're going to push, but they're not pushing the button yet. If they push the button here, they don't get a reward. They have to wait for the little green light on the button to actually show up a few moments later after the instruction stimulus has appeared. So you train to push the monkey to push the button after the trigger stimulus appears. And then what we're going to do is we're going to record from the premotor area as well as you could record from the primary motor area, though I'm not depicting that up here. So here's what you end up getting in terms of the results. So initially, the monkey's just looking at the blank box. It's hungry, it's ready to go, but nothing's actually happening. There's no visual input that indicates that anything's about to happen. And so in this area, its premotor cortex, or in this setting, the premotor cortex isn't really firing much, just a little bit of baseline activity. The moment the instruction stimulus light turns on, though, this is the thing that's supposed to alert the monkey that something's about to happen. You're about to make an action and push the button, but you're not supposed to push the button yet, so you're not actually moving yet, right? There's no movement yet. So in this circumstance, the premotor area starts firing like crazy at this point. You haven't moved yet, but you're kind of anticipating the motion. So if you recorded from the primary motor area during this state, what do you think you would see? So the primary motor area, if it's about sort of the actual actions. Do you think you'd see a lot of action, or I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads? I think that's the idea, yeah. So and if you record from the primary motor cortex, that area that's specifically involved in the motions themselves, the primary motor cortex isn't doing anything right now. But the premotor area here is firing like crazy because you're anticipating, or the monkey in this case is anticipating, I'm about to push this button. And in so doing, I'm going to get a reward, which is why he's doing it. So the premotor area is directly involved in this sort of anticipatory, sort of gearing up to do an action. And then, finally, the trigger stimulus turns on. And at that point, the monkey can reach out and push the button. And so what you see is the premotor area was running already, because it had already started. And then it keeps running a little bit as the monkey executes the movement, and then ultimately it stops. So what do you think the premotor area is doing based on this experiment? What does this tell you about what the premotor area is all about? What do you think? What do you think? Yeah, so okay, so it's it's gearing you up to do some kind of physical action. Good way to put it. What about, I think that's right. What about this? So like this monkey, the monkey looks to me in this picture to be motivated. It's ready to go. Its fingers, it's kind of ready. It's ready to push that button. But nothing's actually happening at that point. So, you could argue that the animal might be anticipating it at this point, but it hasn't started firing yet. So what do we make of that? because it could be anticipating, and anticipating the same motor action that it's going to do ultimately down here, but like what's different between box A and or this, A versus B here? I mean, there's this stimulus, right? I'm kind of fishing here, but so the main thing that's different, in both cases, the monkey might be anticipating doing an action, but here you've got some kind of a visual trigger that's allowing the monkey to sort of directly anticipate that this is going to happen in a moment. So the premotor area seems to be particularly excited in anticipation of doing motion based on some kind of an external cue or external stimulus that the animal is getting. And the same is presumably true of people. We would be, if there's some sort of external stimulus, you're not just thinking about it, there's some sort of external stimulus that is prompting you to do an action, or is prompting you that when you see that stimulus, you know you're about to do an action. At that point, it seems to be really excited. Okay? So you're kind of anticipating something based on some external stimulus. So here's a summary of premotor area. So the premotor area seems to be responding to external stimuli. In that case, it was a visual stimulus, but you can do, you could play sounds or whatnot, and other kinds of external stimuli could stimulate this area as well. It's preparing, we think, it's probably preparing some kind of a motor plan, which is then later going to be executed. And it'll be connected primarily to reticulospinal neurons that control trunk muscles. This is something your book argues based on other sorts of work, but it may be, maybe more about executing sort of the complicated series of actions that have to happen in your trunk versus the actual sort of precise lateral corticospinal tract types of actions. Again, the main thing for me with premotor area, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I don't really like that part of it because the experiment doesn't follow from that. It's all about responding to external stimuli and developing some kind of motor plan, but it's not just you're thinking about the thing in your head. Okay. That's kind of in contrast to this one. So then there's the supplementary motor area, which supplementary motor area sounds kind of like not very exciting to me. It's just the supplement. But this area has some pretty interesting functions. So we'll do a couple different experiments that illustrate some of the diversity of its functions. So in this one, here's the first experiment. You've got this little monkey, and you've trained a monkey to complete a task that requires different coordinated bilateral movements. In this case, it's not terribly complex. What they've done is they've got a little block of wood here, and they jam a little treat in there that the monkey can't pick out with its finger. Instead, what it has to do is stick one hand under the hole and use the other hand like this to push the food through the hole. So you have bilateral movements, so you've got something you're doing with your left hand and your right hand, but they're different in that you've got, a pointer action with one hand and a cupping action with the other hand. And this would be some, different coordinated bilateral types of movements. So that's what you train the monkey to do. And in some cases, you just, you'd have control animals, you let them keep doing that. They're really good at poking things out of holes. But then you have this other group of monkeys where you, and this is an experiment that has been done, where they administer a supplementary motor area lesion to the right side. The fact that it's on the right side isn't that important, but they're causing a lesion in one of their supplementary motor areas. And look at what happens to these things. So now, instead of being able to do the cupping with one hand and the poking with the other, they're like trying to do it, but they end up just like poking with both. It's like they can't do different things with the two hands anymore. So what does that tell you? So the monkey can no longer perform different activities with its two hands. What's that tell you about supplementary motor area function then? I mean, it can still move those fingers. It could still probably do a cupping action with one hand or a pointing action with one hand. But it can't seem to do them differently anymore. So what is the SMA doing for us? You think, yeah? Without the what? Like what kind of things? Can't divide its attention. Yeah? I mean, yeah, it seems like there's clearly this problem where the animal just can't seem to, like, I don't know if it's a dividing attention thing or what exactly it is, but I mean, clearly what seems to have happened is the animal's lost the ability to do different things with its two hands, right? I mean, so that means that the supplementary motor area must be important anytime you're going to try to have sort of concurrent actions with your two hands that don't do, where your hands aren't doing the same thing. So musicians, for example, must be really good at this. My younger daughter's learning to play piano over the past 6 months, and she's starting to move into the thing where she does a different thing with the left hand and the right hand. That's just amazing to me because my hands don't seem to want to do that kind of thing. But the supplementary motor area must be really important for those kinds of functions because you've got your two different actions that you're doing, and they're not simultaneously doing the same thing, so that must involve this area because the monkey has lost the ability to do anything sort of analogous to that. So that's one thing the supplementary motor area seems to be doing, is that it seems to be really important in terms of doing any kind of different bilateral coordinated actions where you're doing one thing with one hand that's not the same thing as you're doing with the second hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Does this only have to do with like the upper extremity?
I think it's lower extremity too. That's a good question. Yeah, so it wouldn't be so much, yeah, I think the idea is not so much like a walking action because you're kind of, even though they're off pace, you're kind of doing the same thing with the two limbs. But if there was some reason that you're, I don't know if you're, I don't have a good example, but if there was some reason that you were doing one thing with your left foot that was different from your right foot, then that would involve probably this area. Maybe. Yeah, no, I can see that. Yeah. Here's another thing supplementary motor area can be involved in. So here's a different experiment. I know these aren't out of your book. Your book kind of references them, but I think these experiments are really cool, so I like to show them. But they're out of this old textbook, so the pictures are all black and white and faded. Sorry. But here is another thing supplementary motor area does. So here's an experiment where this is actually in humans, and they're using imaging analysis to do this experiment. So there's no actual destruction of monkey brains in this case, which is kind of nice. But they ask you, the subjects in this experiment, to do 3 different things. At one point, they'll ask them to grip an object with the fingers. So, you've got a pencil. I can get a pencil. And they just say, grip. Wow, that was great. They say, grip the object with the finger. So you're using your finger muscles. You are actually executing a behavior, but it's a pretty simple action. You're just flexing at this point your finger, and as a result, you're able to grip the little pencil. So that's A. Experiment B, they ask you to, instead of just gripping something with your finger, they teach you this complicated finger wag dance. Sort of, you're kind of like doing some sort of a sequence or pattern with your finger. So it's more complicated then, and it's some sort of precise, series of swirls and twirls and contractions and such. So it's not just gripping, it's more complicated use of some of those same types of muscles. And then in C, rather than actually doing the finger wag dance, they ask you to just sort of mentally rehearse the thing. So this is this is the idea of, if you're an athlete, where you're sort of visualizing what you're going to do. So if you're playing infield defense or something in baseball, you're anticipating, okay, if the ball's hit over there, I'm going to do this. If the ball's hit over there, I'm going to do this, and so on and so on. And you're kind of visualizing those things and playing them out in your head. So there's no actual motion that's happening in C. You're just reimagining yourself doing this precise finger wag sequence. What they did at the same time is they recorded, using brain imagery techniques, they recorded which areas of the brain are getting increased blood flow. And they particularly were interested in the primary motor cortex, which is this area right here, and then the somatosensor, and then the supplementary motor cortex, which is sort of up here. So this area here that's lighting up. So here are the results. When you just grip an object with the finger, what they end up finding is quite a bit of stimulation of your motor cortex. And they're also showing the somatic sensory cortex, which kind of makes sense because that's an area that would also be stimulated. That's the sensory information coming in. But the primary motor cortex is firing, and you'll see it's not dorsal, it's over here in the lateral area, which is where we said all the hand controls are. Right? So that's just gripping the finger. If instead they ask you to do the complex finger wag sequence, your primary motor cortex is firing still because you're executing those muscles, but your supplementary motor area is also firing in this case. And then the fun one is that when you just mentally rehearse the thing but you don't actually move, your motor cortex is silent, but your supplementary motor area is firing like crazy. So what do you make of that? This is the last time I'm going to ask you to do that. But what do you make of that? Like, what is supplementary motor area doing for you? What do you think? Yeah, so it's clearly involved. I mean, what C tells you is it's got to be involved in any kind of mental rehearsal of motor actions that don't involve actual execution of the action, right? It's clearly involved in that. So if you're anticipating doing something, you're just thinking about it, and there's no external stimulus per se, it's just, you're thinking about doing a motor action, but you're not actually executing it, then the supplementary motor area is clearly involved in that, because that's what's going on with this person. That's all they're doing. When you actually execute that action, the supplementary motor area is running. So it's sending information down the spinal cord and maybe to the primary motor cortex. But you certainly also, because you're moving, you've got the primary motor cortex running as well. Right? So the primary motor cortex is going to run anytime you're actually moving. And it is all that's necessary, the primary motor cortex is, when you're doing some kind of simple motion. But if you're doing something complicated, you're probably going to be involving that supplementary motor area on some level. Yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think so. So we said premotor area was also anticipating, right? So like there's a bit of a redundancy there. The way I split these up in my mind is that the premotor area is mostly responding to external stimuli. So there's some other stimulus out there that it's responding to. So in the case of the monkey thing, the warning light goes off that tells you it's almost time to actually hit the button. And then when you finally see the other stimulus, then you hit the button. So you need an external stimulus for the premotor area to be firing. The supplementary motor area is more sort of anticipatory, just within your mind. It's almost like you're thinking about the thing, and therefore you can start running that area. So there's no external stimulus required. So here's sort of my summary of all that. And we'll come back to this on the homework. So the supplementary motor area plans complex bilateral motions. We know that because of the ablation of supplementary motor area function, and the poor monkey can no longer figure out how to poke and cup at the same time. And you do have a lot of crosstalk between the two areas of the cerebral cortex across that corpus callosum, which is that large band of white matter that crosses from the right to the left lobe of the cerebrum. And the supplementary motor area sends lots of signals back and forth across that to help you execute complex bilateral movements. It's responding also to internal stimuli. So it's not reliant on and not dedicated to processing external stimuli. It's more about internal stimuli. So this would be an important site of anytime you're sort of mentally rehearsing movements. So I guess if we go back to the pitching and batting examples, like the baseball stuff, because again, I got baseball in my mind. If you see a batter that's just sort of, by themselves, sort of going through their sequence, or even if they're just kind of sitting there thinking about, hitting a pitch and visualizing it, that's where the supplementary motor area is really coming in. But when they're standing in the batter's box and they see the pitcher starting to wind up, at that point you'd expect their premotor area would be starting to fire, because that's telling them, I'm about to have to pitch or try to hit this pitch, so that you've got an external stimuli in that case. So supplementary motor area is responding to internal stimuli. This is an important site of mental rehearsal of movements. And again, we'll come back to that on the homework. But any questions on that so far? Is that making sense? Is that okay? That's a good stopping point. So I think we'll stop there. We'll continue on Wednesday. Have a good week.